Chapter 2. There was a different receptionist on duty, Paul noticed. When he'd come in for the interview, the girl behind the desk had been a stunning brown-eyed brunette who'd scared him so much he'd almost forgotten his name when she'd asked him for it. Today, her place was occupied by an equally stunning sapphire-eyed ash blonde. "It's Paul Carpenter, isn't it?" she said, smiling at him in a manner liable to cause a breach of the peace. "Mr. Tanner would like to see you in his office straight away." The smile had been bad enough. Usually, when girls like that smiled at him, it was through the thick glass of a TV screen, and they were trying to sell him some hair conditioner. That and the alarming news that he had to go and see someone, presumably one of those terrible partners, before he'd had a couple of hours to calm down and prepare himself for the ordeal, were almost too much for him to cope with. Right, he said. Yes, thanks. Also, how had she known who he was? "Do you know the way?" The way? What was she talking about? Oh, he said. No, sorry. She stood up to point. "Left down the corridor," she said, "through the fire door, turn right, up 2 flights of stairs, then right again, through the photocopier room, turn left, second door on your right, you can't miss it." That statement contained at least one barefaced lie. He could remember as far as through the fire door. "Thanks," he said. "If you get lost, just ask." Right. "I'm Karen, by the way," said the blonde, lifting a telephone receiver. "Pleased to meet you." Yes," he said. "Me too," he added. Then he bolted like a rabbit. It was a large building, and the floor plan turned out to be the sort of thing you'd expect to find if the Hampton Court maze had been designed by the Time Lords. At one point, he found himself in some sort of basement. He could see the soles of people's shoes passing overhead through thick green glass panes in the ceiling. Some time after that, he opened a door and stepped out onto a flat, lead-covered roof. The hairiest moment was when he pushed through the door that ought, by his calculations, to have brought him out into the 4th-floor landing, but which, in fact, opened into a vast, portrait-lined boardroom where 24 men were sitting around a table. He apologised and got out of there as quickly as he possibly could, but not before they'd all swivelled round in their chairs and stared at him. Other discoveries included 2 lavatories, a kitchen the size of Earl's Court, a stationery cupboard filled from top to bottom with typewriter rubbers, and a door that opened to reveal a solid brick wall. "Just ask someone," the receptionist had said. That was all very well, but, apart from the mob scene in the boardroom, the building appeared to be deserted. Bizarre, he thought. Why on earth would anyone want to play a size if they didn't have any people to go in it? He was just painting in his mind a picture of his desiccated bones propped up against a corridor wall when he turned a corner and collided with something extremely solid, which turned out to be one of the partners from his interview. To be precise, the short, wide man with the huge black beard. Blackbeard recovered first, hardly surprising, since he appeared to be built of solid muscle. He said, in what Paul reckoned was probably a Polish accent. "Mr. Carpenter, and how are you enjoying your first day with us?" Paul stared at him for a moment, and then he said, "Excuse me, but are you Mr. Tanner?" For an instant, a frightful scowl hovered on Blackbeard's face, as though he'd just been mortally insulted. Then he laughed. "Heavens, no," he said. "Allow me to introduce myself. Casimir Suslevich." He stuck out a hand you could have landed a sea king on. Paul braced himself for a bone-crunching handshake, which didn't happen. "Dennis Tanner's office is, actually," he said, "it's probably best if I show you the way. This place can be a little confusing, until you get used to it." "Thanks," Paul replied, slightly stunned. "If you're sure it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Mr. Suslevich replied. "Follow me." He set off at a brisk walk, so that Paul had to half-skip, half-trot in order to keep up with him without treading on the backs of his heels. "And actually," Mr. Suslevich called back over his shoulder as they passed the second lavatory, "it might be an idea if I sent you down a map. Would that be helpful, do you think?" Oh, yes, definitely, Paul replied. Thank you very much. No problem, said Mr. Suslovich cheerfully. In a day or so, I am sure you will be able to find your way around in the dark. But to start off with a map, my secretary will bring it down to you this afternoon. Well, Paul thought, that would be something to look forward to, assuming he ever managed to find the place he was supposed to go to after he'd seen Mr. Tanner. Not for the first time, he noticed how hot the building was. He could feel sweat crawling under his armpits, though running up and down a dozen or so flights of stairs in his overcoat might have had something to do with that. Here we are, Mr. Suslovich announced abruptly, coming to a dead stop outside one of 4 identical doors. Hold on, he added, I'll introduce you. He knocked sharply once and jerked the door open, so hard that the wood actually vibrated. Dennis, he said, standing in the doorway and blocking Paul's view. Here is Mr. Carpenter. About time, said someone on the other side. Judging by his voice, Mr. Tanner was Australian. He should have been here 20 minutes ago. Mr. Suslovich smiled at Paul as he slid past and scampered away down the corridor. Paul took a deep breath and went in. He recognised the man behind the desk straight away. Once seen, never forgotten. Mr. Tanner was the freeze-dried child with the acupuncture eyes. Marvellous, Paul muttered to himself as he walked across to the desk. The room was blue with cigar smoke, and it took him a moment to peer through it. All he could see of Mr. Tanner behind a gigantic desk was his head, which looked like a grotesque novelty paperweight on top of a pile of brick-red folders. Got lost, Mr. Tanner said. Yes, Paul replied. Sorry. Mr. Tanner shrugged. Move that stuff and sit down. Paul lifted about 10 pounds weight of files off a narrow plastic chair and sat down. The cigar smoke fog had lifted slightly, and Paul could just about make out the 2 dozen or so framed photographs on the walls. All portraits, signed, of people so astonishingly famous that even he had heard of most of them. Interspersed between the pictures were what looked alarmingly like a collection of tomahawks, each in a glass case with a neat printed label. Mr. Tanner grinned at him. His teeth were unusually narrow, and some of them were almost pointed. Not a wonderful start, he said, getting lost on the stairs. Still, he stubbed out a half-smoked cigar and immediately lit another. First things first, here's your employment contract. He pushed across 2 bundles of typescript, certainly no thicker than the Bible or the omnibus edition of The Lord of the Rings. If you want to sit there the rest of the morning and wade through it all fine, he said, or you could just sign both copies on the back page, where I've marked your initials in pencil, and save us both a lot of time. Paul signed. His pen had run out. Mr. Tanner passed him another without saying a word, and handed back the bundles. Mr. Tanner signed, shoving one copy back to him, and dropped the other into a deep drawer, which he then locked. That's that out the way, then, he said. Next, I expect you'd like to know what you're actually going to be doing. Yes, please, Paul said. Right, Mr. Tanner blew smoke at him. Actually, it's all really simple, boring stuff. Filing, photocopying, collating, stapling things together. For some reason, Mr. Tanner laughed at that, like it was a sick joke. Fetching and carrying, franking letters, making tea. Do you think you can handle it? Paul nodded. I'll do my best, certainly, he said. Mr. Tanner looked at him. That's the spirit, he said. Anyhow, after you've done that for 6 months or so, we'll have another look at you and see if you're actually any use, and take it from there, all right? Fine, Paul said. And, thanks for having me. That just made Mr. Tanner laugh again. It's pretty simple, he said. Do as you're told, don't get under anyone's feet, and we'll get along fine. All right? He picked up his phone and muttered something into it that Paul didn't catch. My secretary's going to take you to the office where you'll be working most of the time, he said. Don't want you getting lost again. Might not find you this side of Whitsun. Anything you want to ask? Not really. Well, I'll tell you something anyway, Mr. Tanner replied. You can call Mr. Suslovich Kez and Mr. Wormtoter Dietrich, or Rick if you'd rather, though I don't suppose you would. But Humphrey Wells is Mr. Wells, Theo Van Spee is Professor Van Spee or Professor, and Judy Castel Bianco is always Contessa, if you value your life. And of course, Mr. Wells Senior is J.W. That ought to go without saying. I'll answer to pretty well anything short of Fido, although I've got to say I don't go much on first names. Makes the office sound like one great big early morning chat show. You can call Benny Shumway down the cashier's office any damn thing you like. He won't take a buying bit of notice of you unless you've got a pink slip signed in triplicate. What you call the girls is between you and your conscience. Right, here's Christine to show you the way. She'll be your real boss for the next 6 months, but it's okay, she doesn't usually draw blood. A moment later, the door opened, and a smart-looking middle-aged woman came in. Since he'd apparently ceased to exist as far as Mr. Tanner was concerned, Paul mumbled, "Thanks," under his breath, then followed her out of the room. "Well," she said, as soon as he closed the door, "see you're Paul Carpenter. I'm Christine." Pleased to meet you," Paul said awkwardly. "Oh, they all say that," she replied cheerfully, and for the next 5 minutes, as he followed her down corridors, up corridors, through doors, up and down stairs, sideways along corridors, and, if he wasn't mistaken, across the same landing twice, she rattled through a barrage of complex information without looking back at him once. "Your reference," she said, "will be PAC. Usually it'd be PC, but we've already got one PC. That's Pauline Church in accounts, and you haven't got a middle name, so we put in an A. The toilets on the 3rd floor are partners only, except in an emergency. Don't ever switch any of the computers off, or we'll have to call out Basingstoke, and nobody will thank you for that. Coffee is 11 to 11:15, and lunch is 1 to 2. We lock the street door, so don't forget anything if you do go out. Tracy and Marcel will do typing for you if they haven't got anything else to do. If you do any letters or anything yourself, send it through to the laser on the 2nd floor. The paper jams, so you've got to stand over it. The strong room keys are in reception, and for crying out loud, don't forget you've got them and go waltzing off. Paper clips and rubbers are in the green cupboard on the 4th floor. Notepads and pencils and felt tips are in the closed file store, but they've got to be signed for. Pens, see me. Dial 9 for an outside line, and if you use a long stapler, make sure you put it back where you got it from. Mr. Wells has 2 sugars in coffee and 1 in tea. Professor Van Spee never has milk. He's lactose intolerant. You're sharing the small back office with the other new clerk. Used to be the 2nd interview room, but the damp's chronic. But I don't suppose you'll be in there very much. Am I all right?" Thanks," Paul said. He hadn't caught any of that, and he was absolutely positive he wasn't going to pick it up as he went along. At least not without a great deal of suffering and embarrassment along the way. All in all, he decided he really wished he'd got the job in the hamburger bar instead. One thing, though, did register with him. What are the new clerk?" he asked. "What? Oh, Sophie, nice girl, you'll like her. That's the broom cupboard there. It's where we store all the file copies of the Financial Times. There's a notebook in there to sign them out if you need to borrow one." That reminded him he'd really meant to ask someone at some stage exactly what it was that J.W.Wells and Co. actually did, but so far there hadn't really been a suitable cue. He thought about asking Christine, but decided not to. "Here we are," Christine announced suddenly in the middle of a detailed account of the system for numbering closed files. "Your new home from home." She pushed open the door and bustled in. Paul, however, stopped dead on the threshold and stood absolutely still, as if he'd just been switched off at the mains. The cause of this extreme reaction wasn't the room itself. It was just a roughly square space, enclosed by 4 white emulsioned walls, a rather dusty Artex ceiling, and a very old carpet-tiled floor containing a bare plywood desk, a scratched green filing cabinet, and 2 plain wooden chairs. It was what was on one of the chairs that got to him. "This is Sophie," Christine went on, apparently not aware that Paul was standing in the doorway doing waxwork impressions. "She managed to get here on time," she added. "You two just hang on here. Someone will be along any minute now to tell you what you'll be doing next. We have a fire drill the first Wednesday in each month. There's a notice on the door that tells you where to go." Paul managed to get out of the way as she bustled out of the room. The doorknob hit him in the small of the back, but he hardly noticed. "You," said the thin girl. "Say something," Paul ordered himself. "Yes," he said. "There's 2 ways I can play this," Paul decided. "I can carry on standing here like a deep frozen ent, or I can sit down." He stayed where he was. You're still wearing your overcoat," the girl said. "Am I? All right." He struggled out of the cord, which had somehow grown far more mechanically complex than he remembered. A button came loose, bounced off his tall cap, and skittered away under the desk. He dumped the coat on the floor, then bent down, picked it up again, and tried to drape it over the back of the chair. It slid off, and he just let it lie. You got the job, then?" he said. "Yes." "Me too." "All right," he promised himself. "I'll shut up now." There was a long, brittle silence, during which his left foot went to sleep. Paul wondered briefly if there was actually anything to stop him walking straight out of the building, apart from the pins and needles, of course, and never coming anywhere near this part of London ever again. He'd signed a contract, of course, but would they really bother to take him to court? Almost certainly not. "Did you see Mr. Tanner?" he asked. "Yes, I know," he told himself. "I promised, but 10 seconds more of this ghastly silence, and my brain will boil out through my ears." The thin girl nodded. "He's horrible," she said. "Did he tell you what they actually do here?" This time she shook her head. "Did you ask him?" "No." "You should have asked him." "I expect we'll find out, sooner or later." She frowned. "I hope so," she said. "Otherwise we're going to look very stupid." The pins and needles had spread to his right foot too. He rested one hand on the desk for balance and tried to keep absolutely still. She was sitting slightly forward in her chair, tiny hands folded in her lap. For some reason, she reminded him of a picture he'd once seen of a man who'd been on death row in some American prison for 20 years. Somewhere, in the distance, a telephone was ringing. It carried on, unanswered, for a very long time. "Big place, this," he said. The Polish bloke said he'd send me down a map," Paul went on. "I hope he does. I got really badly lost just trying to find Hannah's office." She looked at him with mild contempt. "Did you?" she said. "But then," he continued, I never did have much of a sense of direction. My mum says I could get lost in a shoebox." "Really?" His feet tingled sharply, making him wince. "So," he said, "have you got any brothers or sisters?" "Yes." Something like 1,000 years passed, and then she frowned at him and said, "Why don't you sit down instead of standing there?" No, he thought. Don't even try explaining. Just get your bum parked." He sat down, yelping very slightly as his left foot brushed the chair leg. He looked round for a window to stare out of, but there wasn't one. "Did they tell you why you got the job?" the thin girl asked suddenly. "No," Paul replied. "How about you?" "No." If you remember, I was absolutely convinced the dog boy was going to get it," he said. "Who?" "There was a bloke at the interview who looked like a dog." "Was there?" "Please," he thought. "Please can someone turn up with some work or something and rescue me from this? I don't think I can stand." "I'm sorry," the thin girl said. "What?" "I'm sorry," she repeated, gazing down at her closely chewed fingernails. "I'm afraid I'm not really a very nice person." Unanswerable. To his credit, Paul didn't even try. In fact, he said to himself, the hell with it. I can keep my face shut as well as anybody on earth. Just watch me. We'll see who fossilises first. And besides, he consoled himself, every second I spend in here, I'm getting paid for. All the other times I've sat in stony silence with girls were on my own time. That's got to be progress, hasn't it? And the cruel irony of it was, he realised that this was almost, but not quite, the scenario he'd daydreamed about so often, the one where he'd got the job and found himself working side by side with a girl. A nice, jolly girl, of course, but quite nice looking, but not beautiful or anything like that, because that'd mean she'd already have a boyfriend, and that'd be no good. A mere fortnight ago, if a wise old gypsy woman had gazed into a crystal ball and told him she'd seen him sitting in an office with a girl he was going to be working with for the indefinite future, he'd have whooped with joy, because a fortnight ago the hardest thing in the whole world had been finding his way into a situation like this, because for one thing, you never get girls on their own, either they're with their friends or some bloke, always further away than the Pleiades or Orion's belt. Just give me a chance, he'd implored heaven. Just let me be alone with one for 5 minutes, and I'll be able to give it my best shot. Not really a lot to ask, surely, but I should have guessed, he told himself. It's the same as with this bloody horrible job. The worst punishment there is for wanting the wrong thing is getting it. He glanced up. She was looking at him sideways, and to his horror, he knew somehow that she could see what he was thinking. Not fair, he thought, and then hastily tried to wipe it out of his mind, on the off chance that she hadn't seen that too. Not that it matters, he lied to himself. At last and mercifully, the door opened, and through it came a little vole-like woman with large spectacles. She had a big pile of green folders in her arms. "Hello," she said. "I'm Julie." She didn't sound happy about it. "I'm Mr. Wells' secretary." Paul felt like he should stand up or something. Instead he said, "Hello." The thin girl didn't move. "I've got a job for you two," Julie went on, dumping the folders on the table between them. "You're to go through this lot, putting them in date order. There's no particular hurry," she added sadly, "so take your time, and if there's anything you don't understand, come and ask me." She left without giving Paul a chance to say anything, not that he had anything to say. He looked across the desk at the thin girl, and she was already dividing the folders into 2 piles. Inside the folders were thick wadges of printed-out computer spreadsheets, a jumble of tabulated columns of figures, with a date in the top right-hand corner. They were all out of sequence, needless to say. Paul riffled through the contents of the first folder he came to, looking for some clue as to what the spreadsheets were actually about, and wondering what would be the best way of tackling the job. And then he looked up. He saw that the thin girl had already established 5 or 6 neat piles, and was dealing with the spreadsheets out like playing cards from the heap on a lap. "It's easy," she said, without looking up. "Each pile is a month. Once you've sorted them into months, you can sort each month in state order. Then you can just collate them and put them back." "Oh," Paul thought. "Yes, that's not a bad way of doing it." "Thanks," he said. I'll try it your way." "You do what you like," she replied. It was certainly an improvement on silent sitting. Even so, it was frustrating not being able to figure out what any of it was about. The spreadsheets could have been timesheets or accounts or spectrographic analyses of mineral samples or invoices or radio telescope readings or the retail price index or unusually sophisticated betting slips. Or maybe it was some entirely meaningless manufactured task, an intelligence test designed to help assess their numeracy and efficiency. Not that he gave a damn, but for some reason it bugged him. The strong smell of stale cigar smoke suggested that, whatever they were, they had at some stage passed through Mr. Tanner's hands, but that didn't really help much. Still, puzzling over what the wretched things actually were helped take Paul's mind off the tedium of the exercise, and it didn't seem long before he realised he'd finished. He put the papers carefully back in their folders and looked up. The thin girl was still only about a third of the way through her half of the pile, and that surprised him. "Can I help you with your lot?" he asked. "No, thanks," she replied. "I can manage." And that's me told, he thought, but it didn't seem worth picking a fight over, so he nodded and turned back to the first pile he came to. At the back of his mind, a conclusion about those damned spreadsheets was struggling to be born, like a weakling chick trying to peck its way out of a titanium eggshell. "Cohere," he ordered himself. "Now then." He began with the obvious. The earliest printout was 6 months old. The most recent was dated yesterday. There were 5 piles in front of him, and the thin girl had 5 piles as well. He was too scared to check with her, but the odds were that neither of them had any printouts for October. There could be any number of reasons for that, starting with a computer crash that had wiped out the system for 4 weeks, or had lost all the October figures. The numbers themselves, they ranged from tiddly, 0.84, to huge, 4667.863.87, which probably ruled out rain gauge readings or petty cash requisitions. If they stood for money, it was big money. There didn't seem to be much of a pattern to them. He compared the printouts for the 17th of each month, but he couldn't see that they had anything in common. But then, what he knew about statistics and maths in general could probably be memorised by a small frog. Each day had several printouts, some 1 or 2, others as many as 20, but no one day in any month seemed any busier than any other, which didn't help much. All in all, it looked to be one of those problems that gets harder the more you think about it. He frowned. Coded messages, maybe? If each number somehow represented a letter of the alphabet? Julie came in without knocking. She had another armful of folders. "Finished?" she said. The thin girl looked up at her guiltily. "No," she said. "It's my fault. I'm not much good at this." Julie didn't seem bothered. "Well," she said, "here's another lot to be going on with. Like I said, no real hurry. Take your time." Of course, Julie would know that these rotten bits of paper actually were. Probably she wouldn't mind a bit if he asked her, and if she did, the worst that could happen would be that he'd get the sack. And would that be such a terrible disaster? But he couldn't quite bring himself to do it, and she'd gone before he had a chance to search down the back of his moral sofa for his mislaid courage. Also, before he could stop her, the thin girl had partitioned a new pile and added half of it to her existing backlog. Working with her was going to be a riot, he could see that. Still. "Here," he said, "I don't mind doing a few more. Why don't we—" She gave him a look you could have sliced bacon with. "No thanks," she said. "I may be slow and stupid, but I'll manage." He didn't say anything, in more or less the same way that people don't try and shake hands with grizzly bears, and pulled a sheaf of paper towards him. Blessed, therapeutic tedium washed over him like water in the desert. He had work to do, and he got on with it. When Julie brought in the fourth batch, she announced in a singularly mournful voice that they could stop for their coffee break if they liked. Apparently neither of them liked. The thin girl was now almost invisible behind a barricade of paper, and was clearly determined not to rest until she'd caught up, while Paul thought of the coffee room, packed with secretaries, some of them undoubtedly terrifyingly pretty, and the moment of dead silence that would inevitably follow as soon as he walked in, and he came to the conclusion that he didn't want any coffee. At 12:57, Julie brought in the 10th batch, still nothing for October, and reminded them that lunch was 1 till 2. They'd be locking the door at 1 minute past 1, she said, so if they did want to go out, and from the way she said it, she might as well have been addressing Captain Scott and Captain Watts. "Thanks," Paul said, and stood up. He made it through the labyrinth to the front office with seconds to spare. Karen, the receptionist, was just about to shoot back a bolt the size of a young tree. It was just starting to rain, and he'd left his coat in the office, but there were worse things than getting wet. He slipped through the front door, feeling like the last man off the Titanic, and set off down the street at a brisk trot. Now what? Pubs, cafes and sandwich bars were pretty well out of the question, at least until he got paid. Walking the streets in the rain didn't appeal somehow. That didn't leave many choices. In a district rather lacking in shops where you could mooch about and browse without actually spending money, there was also the small matter of hunger. He bought a cheese and stale bread sandwich, but it was in his coat pocket. He could always go home and never come back, but he wasn't quite at that point yet. "It's Paul, isn't it?" He recognised the voice without turning round, though of course he couldn't put a name to it. As far as he was concerned, the owner of the voice was the tennis champion, or the 1970s pop star, depending on personal choice. "Bugger," he thought, and turned around slowly. "Your first day, yes?" Today the tennis champion was wearing a pale grey Armani suit over a white polo neck. The claw necklace was still there. "Join me for lunch. There's a little Uzbek place just around the corner. Just peasant food, but they do a passable kvorma Pavlov." Motorway hedgehog syndrome. The mind goes blank. The motor functions shut down, and although the survival instinct is screaming, "No, no, get out of there," it's wasting its breath. "Thanks," Paul muttered, thinking of the £5.17 he had in his pocket. Well, he thought, look on the bright side. Either this lunatic was going to buy him lunch, which meant he'd be one free meal to the good, or else he was going to spend the afternoon washing dishes with a lot of expatriate Uzbeks, which would almost certainly be an improvement on shuffling paper with the thin girl. Who knew? Maybe they'd take him on full time. The little Uzbek place was very little indeed, so it was awkward that the entire population of central London seemed to be trying to get into it. For a blissful moment, Paul thought he'd been saved, but a waiter materialised at the tennis champion's side and led them through the crush to a table tucked away in a corner. The tennis champion muttered something presumably in Uzbek, and the waiter nodded gravely and vanished. "I hope you won't mind," the tennis champion said. "I ordered for both of us. I think you'll like kvorma Pavlov. I'm going to be boring and stick to the moshkacheri." Paul mumbled something about that being fine by him. A heartbeat later, the waiter was back with 2 enormous platefuls of yellow rice with bits in, and a cauldron of steaming green tea. The tennis champion said something to him, and he roared with laughter before vanishing again. It occurred to Paul that he only had a very sketchy idea of where Uzbekistan actually was. Somewhere near Russia, he'd always thought, but the food looked like curry. "Dig in," said the tennis champion. "Of course, it isn't kvorma Pavlov like you get in Samarkand, but it's a reasonable imitation, even if the barberries are grown under glass. Have some tea." "Thanks," Paul said, as the tennis champion filled his cup. At the next table, 7 Japanese businessmen were comparing ties. "This is very kind of you," he said. The tennis champion smiled. "My name," he said, "is Dietrich Vermtoter, but please call me Rick. Everyone does." So, how are you settling it? Oh, fine. Great, Paul said. It's very, He had no idea what to say next, but the tennis champion was busy shoveling rice with bits in through his mouth like a steamboat stalker trying to win a race. He was very good at it, not so much as a grain of rice or a raisin going astray, but the general impression was distinctly alarming. Paul guessed it was because they had to hurry so as to be back in the office at 2 sharp, and stuck his fork into the yellow mountain in front of him. Actually, it wasn't bad. In fact, it was scrummy, and he wished he was in a fit state to enjoy it. So, what's Julie got you doing? Said the tennis champion with his mouth full. Paul swallowed and said, something with lots of bits of paper, I expect, the tennis champion said. That's one thing I don't like about our little firm. All the bits of paper. Green forms and pink forms and blue forms and miles and miles and miles of computer stuff. He glugged down a whole cup of tea. Paul's cup was so hot, he hadn't dared touch it. The tennis champion obviously didn't feel pain. Still, it's not all like that, I promise you. In 6 months or so, a year maybe, you'll find out what we're really about. Depending on what you decide to specialize in, of course. I mean, it's up to you. You've got to go where your talents lead you. That's the good thing with this business. There's so much scope. Yes, Paul thought, but... He was almost tempted to ask, there and then, but the thought of how stupid he'd look prevented him. Clearly the tennis champion believed he knew all about J.W.Wells and Co. Maybe he'd get the sack if it turned out he didn't. In which case, would he have to pay for his own lunch? Not for the first time in his life, Paul cursed heaven for not letting him in on the secret that everybody else was in on except him. If only he knew, he was sure, he would be able to cope. It'd all be so easy. The thought that the thin girl didn't know either was some small shred of comfort. At least he wasn't the only one. For some reason, though, he didn't want to think about her. Did she like Uzbek food? Did she know where Uzbekistan was? Probably. It was just the sort of thing that everybody else in the world knew, except him. Anyhow, said the tennis champion, tell me about yourself. Not the unimportant stuff you got us at the interview, exam results and all that nonsense. The real you. Oh, God, Paul thought. Well, he started. But fortunately the waiter appeared with another loaded plate of whatever kind of rice with bits in the tennis champion had been eating. He slid out the empty plate and substituted the full one with the practised skill of a production line worker. The tennis champion launched into his mound of food with even greater savagery than before, and didn't stop until his fork screeched on the floor of the plate. Is there something wrong with your Pavlov? He said, or aren't you very hungry? Paul reckoned he'd done pretty well, having eaten in 5 minutes more than he usually got through in a week. Oh, it's absolutely fine, he said. Great, what was it called again? The tennis champion told him, and then embarked on a long and complicated story about some occasion in Tashkent, which had started with him sending the Sarim Sokli back to the kitchen, and ended with a bizarre form of local duel, fought on camels with padded tent poles, which the tennis champion had apparently won. The story went on for quite some time, but Paul didn't mind that in the least, since it meant that he was spared from having to invent the real him to tell the tennis champion about, and could get on with his eating task. Anyhow, the tennis champion said at last, that's enough about me. How about you? Been abroad much? Not all that often, Paul said. The year before last, we had a fortnight camping in the Loire Valley. The tennis champion nodded eagerly. Camping out, he said. When you get right down to it, you can't ever really say you know a place until you've lived rough there. Sleeping in woods or barns, living off the land. Earlier this year, I was in Borneo, and the boatmen who had taken us down the river were all unfortunately captured and held to ransom by a neighbouring tribe. One of those wretched blood feud things they're so keen on. And so there we are, 5 of us with nothing but my knife, a ball of string, and 2 boxes of matches. The Borneo story was even longer than the Tashkent story, and Paul lost the plot after the first 90 seconds, which somehow made it easier to listen to. The arrival of a 3rd helping of rice with bits in added another couple of minutes, and they were on to the coffee stage before the tennis champion stopped talking, at which point he glanced down at his watch and said, Damn, it's 5 minutes to 2. We'd better be getting back. He jumped up, and at once the waiter materialised next to him, holding his coat. As he slid his arms gracefully into the sleeves, as effortlessly as a samurai sheathing his sword, Paul thought he saw a bulge under his left armpit that could have almost been a shoulder holster, or equally something else, an old-fashioned bulky mobile phone, a lady's shoe, 2 pounds of bratwurst. When they reached the office door, Paul made a point of saying "thank you" nicely, the way his mother had taught him, and then he sprinted past the reception desk and headed for his own little room. Clearly he was getting the hang of the place, because he reached his destination with a mere 3 wrong turns and hardly had to retrace his steps once. The thin girl looked like she hadn't moved. The paper mounted in front of her had diminished, but not by terribly much. "You're wet," she said, as he walked in. "It's raining out." "Why didn't you take your coat then?" "I forgot." "Oh." Paul sat down. Part of him was damned if he was going to share his thrilling encounter with this sullen bitch. The rest of him, on the other hand, needed to tell someone, or burst. "You'll never guess what I've just been doing," he said. "No, probably not," she replied without looking up. "Do you mind? I'm very busy." Paul frowned. "Have you had any lunch?" he asked. "No, I don't eat lunch." He could believe that. "You worked all through your lunch hour?" "Yeah. So what?" "Oh, nothing." "You mean I worked all through lunch and I'm still miles behind you? Well, big bloody deal," she sniffed, then wiped her nose on her cuff. Paul wanted to say, "That's not what I meant, and you know it," but he didn't, because if she knew it, as he was prepared to assert, where was the point? He gave her a wounded look, which she failed to notice, and got back to work. He was getting well into it, coming close to attaining the death-of-self trance-like state achievable only through transcendental meditation or very boring paperwork, when quite unexpectedly the thin girl said, "Don't tell me, the senior partner brought you lunch at the Ritz." It wasn't often that he got a feed line like that, and after all, she had been spectacularly unpleasant to him throughout all the time they'd spent together. "I don't think he's the senior partner," he said mildly, "and it wasn't the Ritz, it was rather good little Uzbek place just around the corner. Fairly authentic, kvavrma Pavlov, if you're prepared to overlook the hothouse Barberries." Her head snapped up as though she'd been in a road accident. "You had lunch with one of the partners?" Paul nodded. "Mr." He grovelled on the floor of his memory for the name. "Mr. Wormtoter," he said, though he prefers to just plain Rick. The girl's deep brown eyes were as round as saucers. "Why?" she said. "Sorry?" "Why did he ask you out to lunch?" Paul shrugged. "I haven't the faintest idea," he said. "It's possible he was just trying to be nice." She looked doubtful. "Try again," she said. "Well, actually," Paul replied, "I think that really was the reason, because most of the time he just talked about himself." "Oh." A different sort of "oh" this time. An "oh" that cared. "So what did you find out?" Paul bit his lip. "Not a lot, actually," he confessed. "He told me a long story about getting into a fight in Tashkent, and an even longer one about camping in Borneo. I think he travels a lot," he added, to demonstrate his analytical powers. "That's all?" "Well, he likes the sound of his own voice quite a lot." "You didn't find out what this outfit actually does?" No." "Oh." If there had been a tiny spark of communication between them, like the flash of lightning that links God and Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, it had just fizzled out. Pity, thought Paul. He went back to his spreadsheets, silently cursing Mr. Wormtoter for his gratuitous and unwanted act of kindness. Before he could get anywhere near the trance-like state, however, the door opened and a beautiful girl came in. "Hello," she said to him, apparently ignoring the thin girl completely, and she was smiling too, which was quite uncalled for. "I'm Tracy. I work with Kaz, Mr. Suslovich. He sent this down for you." It was the map, a wonderful, amazing map, a small masterpiece of draftsmanship and calligraphy. The writing, though tiny, was perfectly clear. The layout, showing all 4 floors, was impeccable, and every last detail was carefully annotated. Corridor, window, fire extinguisher, NB, this door opens inwards. A tiny glint of wet ink implied that it had just been drawn, especially for him. Clipped to it was a note. PAC. As promised, hope it's some help to you. Cheers, Kaz. Written in the same perfect, elegant handwriting. Bloody hell, Paul thought. "Thanks," he said. That's really kind." The beautiful girl called Tracy turned up the gain on her smile a little. Oh, he's a very nice man. Kaz always goes out of his way for people. I'll tell him you liked it. Paul nodded. I think I'll have it framed, he said. The beautiful girl called Tracy laughed as though this was the wittiest thing she'd ever heard. I'll tell him you said that, she said. He'll be tickled. See you. It was some time before Paul could tear his gaze away from the map. When he glanced up, he found himself on the wrong end of a look of pure, blood-freezing venom. Kaz, the thin girl said, and Rick, nice to see one of us is fitting in around here. Oh, come on, he wanted to say. It's not my fault if they're being nice to me. Besides, that Tanner bloke was a real bastard. I'll photocopy it for you if you like, he said sheepishly. I think I'll have it framed, she quoted viciously. For God's sake. It was just a stupid joke. That blonde female seemed to think it was a very good joke, she replied, making blonde sound like the worst insult in the English language. Looks like you've made a real hit with everybody today. It was at that moment that Paul felt a terrible, dull, sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach, an awe-shit feeling, such as you'd expect when you discover that the boat is slowly sinking, or the glassy sheen on the tarmac is black ice, because when she said that, his first thought had been that it didn't matter a toss about Kaz and Rick and what's-her-name, the blonde, because he quite obviously hadn't made a hit with the one person. He stopped himself there, but it was too late. He'd admitted it to himself. He knew he had. Bugger. And furthermore, he remembered with a sudden spasm of agony, the thin girl seemed to have the knack of reading him like a book. Cereal bugs with buggery sauce. If you want to copy the map, just tell me, all right? He said, looking away. Or you can copy it for yourself. I don't care. No, thank you. Fine. He made a big deal of shuffling through the papers on the desk in front of him and tried to get back to work. Must get out of this habit, he told himself, as he added another 17th November to the appropriate stack. He had to get out of this bloody stupid habit of falling in love the way a cat bats at a bit of string. It's embarrassing and it's got to stop. It wouldn't be quite so bad if just once he'd had the guts to at least try and make something of it. But he never did. The string twitched, he batted, missed, and immediately panicked and hid under the table till the danger went away. Pathetic. He thought about that. It'd be nice to think that he was making slight progress, and that in this case it had taken the interview, the drink afterwards, and half a day in the same office before he'd given in and jumped under the wheels of the oncoming lorry. But deep inside, he knew that the fuse had certainly blown by the time he'd walked into this room and seen her sitting at the desk, and quite probably before that. Or since at the interview he'd been confident he'd never see her again, which meant he'd be safe, it'd been easier to turn a blind eye to at that stage. Hellfire, he thought. I really wish this sort of thing didn't happen. It's not as though I haven't got enough to contend with already. An hour or so later, Julie came in and delivered another copy's worth of printouts. How are you two getting on, then? She asked. Getting through it? Paul smiled weakly. He'd finished his pile several minutes ago. The thin girl was still floundering like an elephant in a peat bog. I'm the one who's holding everything up, the thin girl said, glaring at Paul as if to say, don't you dare try covering up for me. I'll just have to stay late, that's all. Julie shook her head with rather more animation than she'd shown before. I can't do that, she said. Door's locked at 6:15. Everybody's got to be out before then. It doesn't matter. You can finish it off tomorrow. Or, she added, looking at Paul, you could muck in and do some of hers. It wouldn't kill you, I don't suppose. Anyhow, so long as it gets done eventually. She marched out, leaving Paul with the impression that there was someone else he hadn't made a hit with, though in this case it wasn't such a universal tragedy. When Julie had gone, the thin girl sighed and pushed 2/3 of her pile at him, with the air of a debtor handing over his late mother's wedding ring to the bailiff. Go on then, she said. You'd better do it, since obviously I'm not capable. I expect you get an extra gold star on your end-of-term report or something. He shrugged. Well, it's better than sitting here with nothing to do, he said mildly. You heard her. It doesn't matter. Never does, if you're the one who can do everything, the thin girl replied. That night, after he got home, warmed through a tin of vegetable soup, and sat through 3 soap operas and a cop show on the antique black and white portable his parents had decided wasn't worth taking to Florida, he had another curious dream. He found himself standing on top of a mountain, looking down into a rocky valley, where a caravan of camels was slowly winding its way along a narrow pass. Beside him was a tennis champion. He was holding a sword in one hand and a rocket launcher in the other. One day, the tennis champion was saying, all this will be yours. To which he mumbled something like, oh, gosh, thanks, that'd be really nice. Then the tennis champion morphed seamlessly into the thin girl, and she said, of course, they're bound to pick you, because you're a man. And he was about to try and explain that he didn't really want to be lord of all he surveyed, and hadn't really done anything to deserve it, when 2 young men in funny Victorian clothes walked up the mountain, which was, of course, made up of millions and millions of printed-out computer spreadsheets, all on her side of the desk, and slapped him on the back. Welcome to J.W.Wells & Co., they said. We always knew you'd come back for us, one of these days. Ha ha! Then one of them stapled his ear to the sun with a long black stapler, and the alarm went off.